A wild Mustang stands at the edge of a forest clearing, its eyes locked on a figure in ranger green walking steadily through the wilderness. For 3 days now, this magnificent stallion has been following forest ranger Sarah Chun, maintaining a careful distance of 50 yards, never approaching, never retreating. What started as curiosity has become something deeper, something that defies everything we understand about wild horses and human boundaries. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. What happened next will challenge your understanding of loyalty, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend species. The morning mist clung to the Douglas firs as Sarah Chun shouldered her pack and began her routine patrol through the Cascade National Forest. At 28, she had spent 5 years walking these trails, documenting wildlife, monitoring ecosystem health, and maintaining the delicate balance between human recreation and wilderness preservation. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't pinpoint why. The forest seemed quieter, more watchful, as if holding its breath for something extraordinary. Sarah had always felt more comfortable among trees than people. After losing her father in a climbing accident 2 years ago, she had thrown herself into her work with an intensity that worried her colleagues. The wilderness didn't judge, didn't offer empty condolences, didn't expect her to move on according to someone else's timeline. Here, among the ancient trees and wild creatures, she could simply exist with her grief without explanation or apology. As she rounded a bend near Copper Creek, movement caught her peripheral vision. A flash of copper and cream against the green backdrop made her freeze mid-step. There, standing motionless between 2 towering pines, was a Mustang stallion unlike any she had ever seen. His coat gleamed like burnished bronze in the filtered sunlight, his mane flowing like spun gold down his powerful neck. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, dark, intelligent, and filled with something that looked remarkably like recognition. Wild Mustangs were not uncommon in this region, but they typically fled at the first sign of human presence. This stallion stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle with awareness. She had encountered hundreds of wild animals in her career, but none had ever looked at her quite like this, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he had been waiting specifically for her. Sarah remained motionless for several long minutes, her training kicking in automatically. Never make sudden movements around wild horses. Never attempt to approach unless the animal is clearly in distress. Always maintain a respectful distance. But as she slowly reached for her binoculars to get a better look, the stallion did something unexpected. He took a single step forward, then stopped, his ears pricked forward in what could only be described as invitation. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered, though she knew he was too far away to hear her. "I'm not going to hurt you." The Mustang tilted his head slightly, and Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding flicker in those dark eyes. Then, as if making a decision that would change both their lives forever, he began to follow her. At first, Sarah thought it was coincidence. Wild horses often grazed along the same paths that rangers used, and it wasn't unusual for their routes to overlap. But as she continued her patrol, checking trail markers and documenting plant species, the stallion maintained his position exactly 50 yards behind her. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned left toward the old logging road, he turned left. When she paused to photograph a rare orchid, he waited patiently until she resumed walking. By midday, Sarah had to acknowledge what was happening. This wild Mustang was deliberately following her. She had read about imprinting behavior in young animals, but this horse was clearly mature, probably 8 or 9 years old based on his size and bearing. There was no logical explanation for his behavior. Yet there he was, a constant bronze shadow maintaining perfect distance as she moved through his territory. During her lunch break beside a small alpine lake, Sarah sat on a fallen log and studied her unexpected companion through binoculars. The stallion was magnificent, probably 16 hands high, with the sturdy build and sure footing that spoke of generations of survival in harsh mountain terrain. His coat was unmarked by scars or brands, suggesting he had never been captured or handled by humans. Yet something in his posture, in the way he held his head and watched her every movement, suggested intelligence far beyond typical equine behavior. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked aloud, her voice carrying across the still water. The stallion's ears swiveled toward the sound of her voice, and he took 3 deliberate steps closer before stopping again, as if testing some invisible boundary he had set for himself. As Sarah resumed her patrol that afternoon, she began to notice subtle changes in the stallion's behavior. When she approached areas where the trail narrowed dangerously near cliff edges, he would move to higher ground, positioning himself where he could see both her and the path ahead. When she stopped to investigate unusual animal tracks, he would circle to a position that gave him a clear view of the surrounding area, his body language alert and protective. It was during one of these moments, as Sarah knelt to examine what appeared to be fresh bear's sign, that she first understood the depth of the stallion's vigilance. A branch snapped somewhere in the dense undergrowth to her left, and before she could even look up, the Mustang had moved. Not toward her, but between her and the sound, his head high, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. His entire body radiated tension, ready to act if necessary. The sound turned out to be nothing more than a deer moving through the brush, but the stallion's protective positioning had been unmistakable. This wild horse, who had never been touched by human hands, was watching over her with the dedication of a trained guardian. That evening, as Sarah made camp at her designated backcountry site, the stallion settled himself on a small rise about 100 yards away, close enough to keep watch, far enough to maintain his wild dignity. Sarah found herself talking to him as she prepared her simple dinner, sharing observations about the day's wildlife sightings and the changing weather patterns she had noticed. "You know, I've been walking these trails for 5 years," she said, stirring her camp stove meal while keeping one eye on her silent companion. "I've seen bears, cougars, even a few wolves. But I've never had a bodyguard before." The stallion's ears flicked toward her voice, and Sarah could have sworn she saw his head nod slightly in acknowledgement. As darkness fell, Sarah settled into her sleeping bag with a strange sense of security she hadn't felt since her father's death. The stallion remained on his hill, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, and somehow his presence made the vast wilderness feel less empty, less lonely. The second day brought new revelations about her mysterious follower. As Sarah conducted her morning equipment checks and prepared for another day of patrol, she noticed the stallion had moved during the night. Fresh hoofprints in the soft earth around her camp showed that he had circled her site multiple times, creating a protective perimeter. Not once had he approached close enough to disturb her sleep, but his vigilant patrol had continued through the dark hours. "Did you sleep at all?" Sarah asked as she packed her gear. The stallion stood waiting at his usual distance, looking alert and ready despite his nighttime vigil. As they resumed their strange partnership, Sarah began to pay closer attention to the stallion's behavior patterns. She noticed that he seemed to know the terrain better than she did, often positioning himself at vantage points that gave him oversight of the trail ahead. When she approached areas where rock slides or fallen trees created potential hazards, he would move to positions that suggested familiarity with safe passage routes. It was during the afternoon of the second day that Sarah first began to suspect there was more to this story than simple animal curiosity. She had stopped to document a family of river otters playing in a beaver pond when she noticed the stallion behaving differently. Instead of his usual watchful stance, he was moving restlessly, his attention focused not on her but on something beyond the pond. Following his gaze, Sarah spotted what had captured his attention, a small wooden cross, weathered gray by years of mountain weather, partially hidden among the tall grass near the water's edge. Someone had placed wildflowers at its base, though they were old now, dried by sun and wind. Sarah approached the makeshift memorial carefully, aware that the stallion had moved closer than ever before, his usual 50-yard distance reduced to perhaps 20 yards. The cross bore a simple inscription, carved by hand in rough letters. Jake Morrison, beloved son and friend of all wild things, age 16. Below the name, someone had added a date from 3 years ago, and a brief message that made Sarah's breath catch. He saved them all. Sarah knelt beside the cross, her mind racing with questions. Who was Jake Morrison? What had happened here 3 years ago? And why did the stallion's behavior change so dramatically in this place? As if responding to her unspoken questions, the stallion moved even closer, close enough that Sarah could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, the way his nostrils flared as he caught her scent. For the first time since their strange partnership began, he nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry both greeting and sorrow. "Did you know him?" Sarah whispered, reaching slowly toward the stallion. "Did you know Jake?" The Mustang didn't flee from her extended hand, but he didn't approach either. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an expression that seemed to hold years of patient waiting, of loyalty that transcended understanding. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. Instead of camping at her designated site, she set up her tent near the memorial, close enough to the pond that she could hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The stallion settled himself even closer than usual, his vigil now taking on the quality of a shared remembrance. As Sarah prepared her dinner, she found herself speaking to both the stallion and the memory of the unknown boy whose cross stood sentinel by the water. "I lost someone too," she said quietly. "My dad. He was a climber, like maybe Jake was a friend to wild horses. People don't understand how losing someone changes everything, how it makes you want to hold on to anything that connects you to them." The stallion's ears remained pricked toward her voice, and in the gathering darkness, Sarah could see his eyes reflecting the light from her small campfire. "Is that what this is about? Are you still waiting for him to come back?" The question hung in the cool mountain air, unanswered but somehow understood. The third day brought both revelation and heartbreak. Sarah woke to find the stallion standing directly beside Jake's memorial, his head lowered as if in prayer or remembrance. The sight was so moving, so clearly deliberate, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes before she fully understood why. As she approached with her morning coffee, the stallion looked up at her with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of years. Then, in a gesture that defied everything Sarah knew about wild horse behavior, he walked directly to her and gently pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. The contact lasted only seconds before he stepped back, but the message was unmistakable. This magnificent creature had chosen to trust her, to share with her the burden of loyalty and loss that he had carried alone for 3 years. "You've been waiting for him, haven't you?" Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "All this time, you've been coming back here, waiting for Jake to return." The stallion's response was to move to the cross again, this time pawing gently at the earth beside it. As Sarah watched in amazement, he uncovered something that had been buried in the shallow soil, a weathered leather halter, sized for a young horse, with copper stamped into the leather in childlike letters. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the halter, understanding flooding through her like a dam breaking. This wasn't just any wild Mustang following her through the forest. This was Copper, Jake Morrison's horse, still carrying the love and loyalty of a boy who had died 3 years ago. "Oh, Copper," Sarah breathed, and at the sound of his name, the stallion's ears shot forward, his entire body quivering with recognition and something that looked remarkably like relief. "You remember your name. You remember him." The pieces of the story began falling into place as Sarah examined the halter and recalled fragments of news reports from 3 years earlier. Jake Morrison, 16 years old, son of a local rancher, had been caught in a flash flood while trying to rescue a herd of wild Mustangs trapped in a box canyon. He had managed to free the horses, including a young stallion he had been working with, but the effort had cost him his life. The young stallion he had saved was Copper, who had apparently never forgotten the boy who died saving him and his herd. For 3 years, Copper had been returning to this spot, waiting for Jake to come back, maintaining a vigil of loyalty that spoke to the deepest bonds between human and animal. And now, for reasons Sarah was only beginning to understand, he had chosen to follow her, perhaps recognizing in her something that reminded him of his lost friend. As Sarah knelt beside Jake's memorial, Copper approached again, this time allowing her to touch his neck, to feel the warmth of his coat and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The contact was electric, a connection that seemed to bridge the gap between species, between past and present, between loss and hope. "He must have loved you very much," Sarah whispered, her fingers gentle on Kappa's neck. "And you loved him too, didn't you? That's why you can't let go." Kappa's response was to lower his great head until it rested against Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound that Sarah felt her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Here was grief that matched her own, loyalty that put her own struggles with loss into perspective, love that transcended death itself. That afternoon, As Sarah continued her patrol with Copper following at his usual distance, she found herself thinking about the nature of loyalty, about the way love persists even after its object is gone. Her own grief for her father had driven her into isolation, into a wilderness both literal and emotional, where she could avoid confronting the depth of her loss. But Copper had chosen a different path. His grief had become a vigil, his love transformed into patient waiting, his loyalty expressed through years of faithful return to the place where his friend was remembered. As they walked together through the forest, Sarah began to understand that Copper's decision to follow her wasn't random. Somehow, this remarkable horse had recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss, someone who might be worthy of the trust he had held sacred for 3 years. The realization brought both comfort and responsibility. Copper wasn't just following her. He was choosing her, offering her the same loyalty he had given to Jake, trusting her with the sacred duty of remembrance and love. That evening, as they camped again near Jake's memorial, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She opened her satellite phone and called her supervisor, requesting permission to extend her patrol indefinitely to investigate reports of unusual wildlife behavior in the area. "I need more time to document this properly," she explained, which was true, though not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Copper alone with his vigil, couldn't abandon this magnificent creature who had shared his deepest loyalty with her. As darkness fell, Sarah found herself talking to both Copper and Jake's memory, sharing stories of her father, of the climbing accident that had taken him, of the way his loss had changed her relationship with the world. "I stopped believing in connections after Dad died," she admitted, her voice carrying across the still water of the pond. "I thought if I didn't get close to anyone or anything, I wouldn't have to face that kind of loss again. But you're teaching me something different, aren't you, Copper? You're showing me that love doesn't end with death, that loyalty can be its own form of healing." Copper raised his head from grazing and looked directly at her, his dark eyes reflecting the stars that had begun to appear in the clear mountain sky. The 4th day brought a test that would define the true nature of their bond. Sarah woke to the sound of Coppa's urgent nickering, a sound unlike any he had made during their time together. Alert instantly, she emerged from her tent to find the stallion pacing restlessly, his attention focused on the forest beyond the memorial site. Following his gaze, Sarah spotted the source of his agitation, a young Mustang filly, probably 2 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing. The filly was clearly in distress, favoring her left front leg and bearing what appeared to be fresh wounds on her shoulder and flank. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Wild horses in distress often meant predator encounters, and an injured animal could attract dangerous attention. But as she reached for her radio to call for wildlife assistance, Copper did something that stopped her cold. The stallion approached the injured filly with a gentleness that spoke of deep familiarity. He nickered softly to her, touching his muzzle to her neck in a gesture of comfort and recognition. This wasn't a chance encounter. This filly was part of Coppa's family, probably his daughter, and she had come to him for help. Sarah watched in amazement as Copper guided the young horse toward the memorial site, positioning her near the water where she could drink and rest. His movements were deliberate, protective, and filled with the same careful intelligence he had shown in watching over Sarah. "She's yours, isn't she?" Sarah whispered, and Coppa's ears flicked toward her voice in acknowledgement. "She's hurt, and she came to you for help." The situation presented Sarah with a dilemma that challenged everything she thought she knew about her role as a forest ranger. Protocol demanded that she report the injured animal and wait for wildlife veterinarians to assess the situation. But the filly's wounds appeared to be from a cougar attack, and in her current condition, she wouldn't survive another encounter with a predator. Moreover, Coppa's behavior made it clear that he expected Sarah to help. The trust he had placed in her over the past 4 days had led to this moment. His family member was in danger, and he was asking her to prove worthy of the loyalty he had offered. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. She approached the injured filly slowly, speaking in the same gentle tone she had used with Copper, allowing the young horse to catch her scent and assess her intentions. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured, noting the depth of the claw marks on the filly's shoulder. "I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me." The filly's eyes were wide with pain and fear, But Copper positioned himself beside her, his presence clearly communicating that Sarah was safe, that she could be trusted. With infinite patience, Sarah managed to clean the wounds with water from her pack and apply antibiotic ointment from her first aid kit. The process took over an hour, with Copper standing guard and offering comfort to his daughter throughout the treatment. Sarah had never been so close to wild horses for such an extended period, and the experience was transformative. These weren't just animals. They were individuals with complex relationships, deep emotions, and the capacity for trust that transcended species boundaries. As Sarah finished bandaging the worst of the filly's wounds, she realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with Copper. No longer was she simply the object of his protective vigil. She had become part of his family, someone worthy of his trust and deserving of his loyalty. That evening, as the filly rested beside the memorial with Copper standing guard, Sarah found herself thinking about the nature of family, about the way love expands to include those who prove themselves worthy of trust. Her own family had been small, just her and her father after her mother died when Sarah was 12, but their bond had been unbreakable until his climbing accident shattered her world. Now, sitting beside a mountain pond with two wild horses who had chosen to trust her, Sarah began to understand that family wasn't just about blood relations. It was about loyalty, about showing up when it mattered, about proving yourself worthy of trust through actions rather than words. "Jake would be proud of you," Sarah said softly to Copper as he maintained his vigil over his injured daughter. "He saved your life, and now you're saving hers. That's what love does. It keeps giving, even when it hurts." Coppa's response was to approach Sarah and rest his great head against her shoulder again, a gesture that had become their private language of understanding and trust. The fifth day brought both challenge and resolution. Sarah woke to find the filly standing and moving more easily, though still clearly favoring her injured leg. The wounds were clean and showed no signs of infection, suggesting that Sarah's wilderness first aid had been effective. But the improvement in the filly's condition also meant that decisions had to be made. Sarah's extended patrol couldn't continue indefinitely, and she couldn't simply abandon her responsibilities as a forest ranger. Yet the thought of leaving Copper and his daughter felt like a betrayal of the trust they had placed in her. As she pondered her options, Sarah's satellite phone rang with a call from her supervisor, District Ranger Tom Bradley. The conversation that followed would change the course of her career and her life. "Sarah, I've been getting some interesting reports about your extended patrol," Tom said, his voice carrying both concern and curiosity. "Hikers are talking about a ranger who's been traveling with wild Mustangs. Care to explain?" Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything. About Coppa's initial following behavior, about discovering Jake Morrison's memorial, about the injured filly and the extraordinary trust these wild horses had placed in her. "Tom, I know how this sounds," she concluded, "but I've witnessed something remarkable here. These horses aren't just wild animals. They're individuals with complex emotional lives, and they've chosen to trust me with something sacred." There was a long pause before Tom responded. "Sarah, what you're describing challenges everything we think we know about human-wildlife interactions. If what you're saying is true, if this stallion has maintained a 3-year vigil for a dead boy and has now transferred that loyalty to you, then we're looking at behavior that could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition and emotion." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying that I want you to continue documenting this relationship, but officially this time. I'm reassigning you to a special research project studying human-wildlife bonds. You'll work with Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the university's Animal Behavior Program to document and study what you've observed." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as the implications of Tom's words sank in. She wouldn't have to abandon Copper and his daughter. Instead, she would be able to continue building the relationship that had already transformed her understanding of loyalty, love, and the connections that transcend species boundaries. "There's one more thing," Tom continued. "I did some research on Jake Morrison after your reports. The boy was something special. He'd been working with wild Mustangs since he was 12, developing techniques for gentle interaction that were years ahead of their time. His death was a real loss to the conservation community. Copper remembers him," Sarah said quietly. "After 3 years, he still remembers and honors their bond." "Then maybe it's time someone continued Jake's work," Tom replied. someone Copper has chosen to trust. That afternoon, as Sarah waited for Dr. Rodriguez to arrive with proper veterinary supplies for the filly, she sat beside Jake's memorial and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been an isolated ranger using wilderness work to avoid confronting her grief. Now she was part of something larger, a story of love that transcended death, loyalty that bridged species, and trust that could heal even the deepest wounds. Copper approached as she sat in contemplation, his usual careful distance reduced to mere inches. For the first time since their relationship began, he allowed her to stroke his neck freely, to feel the power and gentleness that defined his character. "You've been teaching me about love," Sarah whispered to him. "Real love doesn't end when someone dies. It finds new ways to express itself, new people to include, new purposes to serve." As if in response to her words, the filly approached as well, her young courage overcoming her natural wariness. Soon Sarah found herself sitting between two wild horses who had chosen to trust her, surrounded by the kind of family she had never expected to find. Dr. Rodriguez arrived that evening with veterinary supplies and a team of graduate students eager to document the extraordinary relationship Sarah had described. But as they set up their equipment and prepared to begin their formal study, Sarah realized that the most important discoveries had already been made. She had learned that grief could be transformed into purpose, that loyalty could bridge any gap, and that love, true love, never really dies. It simply finds new ways to express itself, new hearts to touch, new lives to transform. As the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that matched the stallion's magnificent coat, Sarah understood that her story with Copper was just beginning. Jake Morrison's legacy would live on through their bond, expressed in new ways but rooted in the same profound truth, that love, once given freely, creates connections that transcend time, species, and even death itself. Copper stood beside her as darkness fell, no longer a wild Mustang following a stranger through the forest, but a partner in a relationship built on mutual trust, shared loss, and the kind of love that makes all things possible. Together, they would honor Jake's memory while building something new, a bond that proved love never truly ends. It simply finds new ways to heal the world. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who loves inspiring animal stories. Together we can spread a message of compassion and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals.